So we did an egg collection, and which was successful, and tried and got pregnant with Rocky.
Yeah.
And it all was going absolutely smoothly. And then we got to 9 weeks, and I started having some bleeding. And then it turned out to be a subcutaneous hematoma.
Right.
It's like a mass, which can, I'm sure that's the correct term, which can be fine. Because, of course, you start Googling everything.
Yeah, especially nowadays. I mean, you said anything said to you and you're straight on your phone.
Yeah. So, and, it was monitored for a while. As I said, I have this blood disorder, so I was having to take heparin as well, which I'd had to throughout the other pregnancies, and it never caused an issue. But this sort of went on, and the bleeding sort of stopped and started. But each scan, baby was growing well, etc. And then
with that mass, what was that? What could potentially happen with that?
Well, as long as it's monitored, it can be absolutely fine, or it can cause miscarriage.
Right.
And it sort of, then the bleeding got very heavy, but again, everything seemed fine. They'd do the scans. So I was on pretty much bed rest from then. And then, then it would sort of stop and it would all be fine again. And then it got really painful I was 19 weeks. And so I went into hospital and they were sort of monitoring me. And, again, everything fine on the scan. And I remember it was Gordon and Tilly had come in to see me at the hospital one evening. And I sort of leant over to speak to Gordon, and then my waters broke. And it just went from everything's fine, we're just monitoring you, to baby's going to be born. And that was the most traumatic thing ever, because there are parts of it that I almost can't remember, I think, because I've blocked it out. But I'd never had a miscarriage. I'd never had anything like that. And I remember them just saying to me, there's nothing we can do now. You're going to have to give birth. And I remember Gordon just looked at me. He said, I'm not going anywhere. He said, I'm staying in for this. And I was like, it wasn't very nice. And some friends of ours came, and all the other kids were there. And it was, I think
all the kids came.
Yeah, I think that was the hardest thing as well, was seeing them deal with it. And sorry.
It's okay.
And how sad they were, and just how traumatic, because it was like it was a whole family pregnancy, if you like, because they were so invested. And when I'd had the bleeding, and that Holly especially had been with me, because she was the one that was at home the most, and it was just knowing I couldn't do anything to take away their pain.
Yeah.
And then they said, this might take a good couple of hours. And I said, no, it's going to happen in half an hour, and it did. And he was just the most perfect little boy. And I think that's the thing, is that you don't know what to expect, but it's like this tiny, tiny little doll. And, we didn't know he was a boy. And I remember that when they came in after, and Jack said, did I have a brother or a sister? And I said, it was a brother. And it was really hard. It was really hard. And then it's that feeling of emptiness.
Yeah.
And then the next morning you're leaving the hospital and you haven't got a baby. And it was a huge shock, I think, because we never thought that anything would go wrong, as you don't.
No.
Maybe slightly naive. I'd had 4 children, so statistically you think, I think that's what shocked me, was afterwards the amazing outpouring of messages and support, and people telling me their stories. And I'd been so unaware of that, so unaware of what people go through.
Yeah.
You live in this bubble of, I've got kids, this, that, and then you realise the trauma and the heartache and what can really happen. So, when you look back on things, when you say I wouldn't change anything, it definitely made me so much more aware and empathetic, and I suppose, just listening to people, because I found the hardest thing was when people wouldn't say anything, because all I wanted to do was talk about it for a long time. Years after, because it took us a long time to get pregnant again. I had several miscarriages after that, but they were very early on.
Right.
And I suppose I'd never dared hope, because you learn so much more about things that they can do to check if a pregnancy is progressing well.
Yeah.
Your levels, everything like that, regular testing. So I'd know pretty early on if my levels weren't rising the way they were meant to.
Mm-hmm.
It's unlikely this is going to go any further. And
it must have been so hard birthing Rocky, knowing that once he was in the world that you would lose him.
And I think I remember saying to the amazing midwife, and I said to her, what will happen? Will he be born breathing? Will his heart be beating? And she said, I just don't know. And, which they don't.
Yeah.
And I just remember him being placed in my arms, and I was so scared. I didn't know whether, should I hold him? And to be scared of your own baby, you've got this, you just want to protect them. But I was like, I don't want, if he's breathing, I don't want to do anything to stop him, and maybe he'll survive. And I think that was the hardest thing after, was also hearing people who'd had babies born at 24, 25 weeks, and I felt so guilty. What if I hadn't what if I'd done something differently? How was it that, their baby can make it to 24 weeks and now they've got them at home and you'd never know they were born early? What did I do wrong? Why didn't I hold on that little bit further? And that mentally was a lot to deal with, I think. But at the same time, I was also so aware that the other kids were so sad and traumatized, and more than anything, they were also scared about me.
Really?
Because they didn't know what to do, and they're very protective.
And also, you're their mum, to see you in that vulnerable state, to see you going through that pain.
And that, I think that's when we decided to try again. Not that you want your kids to sit down and say, shall we have another baby? But at the same time, you have to take that into account. And thank God they were all like, we all feel we really need to try again.
As a family, did you have to work through that grief together?
Yes, definitely. And we talked about it a lot. We planted a tree for Rocky.
You still very much talk about Rocky. Rocky is still very much a part of your lives.
He really is. And it's hard sometimes, though, because you never know when people say, well, how many children do you have? You don't want to say.
That's why I said many children at the start. Because I
never know. If I say 6, I then feel guilty.
Yeah.
But at the same time, you don't want to make other people feel uncomfortable. And is it correct to include him? He'll always be our son. But I don't know. I still haven't worked it out myself.
Yeah.
And it's a really hard one. But I suppose I had never imagined, crazy though it is, for him to look so perfect as if there's nothing wrong.